This is the Nikon Z 24-120mm f4s, and it's my new favorite lens. I've been capturing tons of incredible images around Japan these past couple of weeks with it, and today I want to give you my first impressions of it. One of the big reasons why I gravitated towards this lens is because of the focal length. This lens is a 24-120, which goes from a relatively wide focal length to a medium telephoto in a pretty compact package, which makes it great for capturing wide, expansive landscapes, but can isolate a single subject when you want to in a pitch. While I was in Japan, this was a huge advantage. You see, Japan has a ton of isolated alleyways, which look incredible when it's wide open, which means I can showcase the tons of buildings on the left and right hand side with the power lines that give off a slice of life type of feel. But there were other times when I wanted to give the street a more compressed feel and bring my subjects closer together. This is just one of many examples why having a diverse focal length to work with can get you so many different perspectives. But street photography isn't the only place where this lens thrived, as I ended up shooting a ton of landscapes on this trip, and to my surprise, this lens killed it. Of course, when I shoot landscape photography, I generally want a wider focal length, like 14mm, when shooting a beach cliffside or other expansive landscapes. And although 24mm isn't ideal for landscape photography, it handled a lot of these situations just fine. I was still able to get plenty of the subjects that I wanted to showcase in my frame. Whether it was a massive temple or a cityscape overlooking the water, I was comfortable with the 24mm on the wide end. Granted, I do like my 14mm lens because I can help exaggerate elements at the edge of the frame, but I wasn't ever disappointed with the images at 24mm. But we also have to remember that this lens goes out to 120mm. So how was that for landscape photography? I actually thought this is more of a strength of this lens over the wide side. 120mm is a nice medium telephoto focal length and could comfortably get large subjects that are far away. For those farther subjects, I would zoom in as far as I could, but build a more complex composition which includes more elements than I normally would use when shooting with a telephoto lens. I ended up coming out with very pleasant images and captured exactly what I wanted to showcase without many issues. I've been talking a lot about the wide and long end of this lens, but you also have to remember there's a lot of other different focal lengths that we have to work with, like 35, 50, 85, and even 100mm. Which are all very common focal lengths and are super useful for grabbing whatever composition you'd like. The best part about the 24-120 is that it has a lot of common focal lengths within this lens, which are deemed the standard focal length, which for 95% of all photography, this is a sweet spot. I was able to capture everything from street to portraits to even landscapes without any problem. And I actually really enjoy the different perspectives of the 24-120. And some of you might look at this lens and go, psh, an f4 lens? That's not bright enough. Which is why a 24-70mm f2.8 would be better, right? Well, here's the thing. If you wanted a fast zoom lens that's great in low light situations, this probably isn't the lens for you. I did find f4 to be a tad slow, especially when shooting at night. But if you're not really shooting any fast action, I didn't really see this lens being a problem. The camera I was using, the Nikon Z6 III, had solid IBIS, and I could grab handheld shots around 1/10 of a second pretty comfortably, even at long focal lengths. And to be honest with you, the f4 aperture of this lens was a major point of contention that I had, especially for someone coming over from the 24-70 f2.8. But when shooting in the real world, I didn't find it to be that big of a deal. Majority of the time, I found myself just shooting at slower shutter speeds or bumping up the ISO when need be. It was way less of an issue than I thought, and I was more than fine with the aperture in those low light situations. Another aspect of this lens that I was concerned about when it came to the aperture was how the bokeh looked. I am not gonna lie, I do love bokeh. I know, but this was also something that I was kind of concerned about when going to an f4 aperture. However, I was pleasantly surprised. We get a 9-bladed aperture, which created nice, pleasant bokeh. It wasn't super overwhelming, but instead soft and didn't completely obliterate the background. What's sick about this lens though, is that if you wanted to maximize your bokeh, you can always shoot at 120mm, which gives you plenty of that soft background, and surprisingly, shooting at f4 was almost always a benefit. because the main subject you were shooting will be more in focus and thus much sharper than if you were to shoot at an f1.8. It was a very nice balance between blurring out the background and getting your main subject sharp. I was personally a big fan of it and had no issue capturing stunning portraits of my friends. Now the last point I want to touch on before talking about this lens's image quality is something that I wasn't really expecting to be good. And that's the macro capabilities. Just take a look at these photos. They're insane. And mind you, all these plants are stupid tiny. I'm talking smaller than a penny. And this lens was able to capture it all. Granted, you have to use the 120mm side of this lens to access that super macro look, because this lens will essentially keep the same focus distance no matter what focal length you're at. Which is fine. I mean, when you're shooting macro lenses, you generally want to be at the longest focal length anyways. Of course, this isn't going to fully replace a macro lens, but it's more than good enough for a lot of photographers out there who don't need or want a dedicated macro lens. Whew, I know that was a lot, but I promise you, this lens's focal length is truly special and is honestly what makes this lens so good. And if you're wondering why I picked up this lens, I actually made a whole video on my Patreon that goes through why I bought it and a bit of my experience out in Japan. It's a fun video and I'm planning on posting more content around me and my life through Patreon, so make sure you're signed up to experience the world with me. But now, let's move on to one of the other incredible parts about this lens. Now when I say this lens is very sharp, I don't mean, oh yes, very nice, lots of detail. I mean so sharp it could cut you if you just hit yourself with it. I'm just kidding, but seriously, this lens is dummy sharp. Whether you're shooting wide open or stop down, I found this lens retains so much detail throughout the entire image without any issue. It's a strong suit of this lens and is why I would put this on the same level as the 24-70mm f2.8, maybe even slightly better. And that's the second best lens I've ever used. It most likely resolves past what my Z6 III can handle and should be more than fine with a higher resolution camera like the Z8. This lens does come with 16 elements, and even though it has lots of glass in it, I haven't seen it affect the image quality at all, as this lens still boasts incredible micro contrast with tons of pop in the image, giving the subject a lifelike type of feel. They pop straight out of camera and are simply stunning. It's some of the best micro contrast I've seen out of a lens, period. The 24-120 also boasts great color rendition with accurate and pleasing colors. You won't have to worry about the colors looking skewed or off-tint anytime soon. When it comes to vignetting, you will see a little bit of it wide open throughout the focal length, with it being the most prevalent at the widest focal length of 24mm. But for the most part, I haven't really found it very distracting at all, and I'd be pretty happy with how it performs. Of course, if you are super worried about vignetting, you can always stop it down a bit to mitigate it, and I have found it cleans it up pretty early and very nicely. The lens has almost zero chromatic aberrations, which are those green and purple fringing you see in high contrast scenarios, and it corrects for it very well. So you don't have to worry about shooting this thing at the sun anytime soon, which I would not recommend you doing. Anyways, this is an S-line lens and absolutely lives up to that expectation when it comes to image quality. Of course, this is only my first look at this lens and I absolutely need to test it out more. But for now, I am very impressed with this lens and I'm very confident that it will come out with incredible images no matter what scenario is thrown at it. So far, I've given this lens massive praise for its image quality, but what about its ergonomics? The 24-120's ergonomics is definitely one of the best parts about this lens. Although it's not built with a ton of metal everywhere, it still feels very sturdy with the plastics that aren't cheap and feels good in the hands. There is metal at the bottom of the lens here next to the mount, but honestly, I'm actually kind of glad that they built it this way with a lack of metal, because it's able to be more lightweight as a result, and I definitely prefer that. As it comes in at 630 grams while being 4.7 inches when at 24mm. The lens feels amazing in the hands when paired with my Nikon Z6 III and balances perfectly with my full frame camera. It's incredibly comfortable to hold and wield for long periods of time, which is exactly what I was doing in Japan. Walking for hours on end, just shooting with this lens without too much stress on myself. One part that Nikon did a great job on was the different rings on this lens. The zoom ring feels great to turn with a bit of resistance against you turning the lens. It's tight and allows you to grab a precise focal length when you need it. It's one of the best zoom rings that I've used out of any other lens and feels very secure when turning it. The same can be said about the manual focus and control rings, which is especially important with the manual focus ring to get pinpoint accurate focus when you're super close to a subject. The control ring has a ribbed texture on it, which is similar to how they did the 17-28mm control ring. But especially during run and gun situations, having that control ring has been super helpful for getting the perfect exposure. Because I'll set the camera to shutter priority while setting the control ring to exposure compensation. Then I can turn the control ring to increase or decrease the exposure for more accurate exposures. It's super useful in high contrast scenarios with a bright sky and dark foreground to fine tune the camera's exposure. Let's now move over to the side of the lens where you can see an AF/MS switch, which allows you to switch between autofocus and manual focus in a pinch, which made a huge difference when I wanted to capture macro images with the lens. There is also a programmable function button right here, which I personally have set to 2x magnification, but of course you can set it to a whole slew of other different functions. This button is actually really nice. It's very clicky and doesn't require a ton of force to push it in. This lens is built just right in pretty much every aspect of it. But if you've been watching this video and still aren't sure whether or not this is the right lens for you, then this next part should help. The photographer that should be getting this lens is someone that wants a standard zoom but doesn't really need that f2.8 aperture. Because if you don't need that fast aperture, then this is the better option over the 24-70 f2.8. Having an extra 50mm on the long end is a huge deal. That's over 70% more focal length versus the 24-70, and it makes a huge difference when grabbing the composition you want. This makes the lens far more versatile and convenient in a standard zoom sort of lens, which is the entire ballgame with this lens. The versatility is unmatched, with great macro capabilities, long zoom range, and a form factor that makes it easy to carry around for long periods of time. It's funny because when I picked up this lens in Japan, I actually had the 24-70mm f2.8 with me, but ended up not using it once I picked this lens up halfway through my trip. I got this lens in Kyoto for around $850 and it was tax-free, so I did save a bit of money there, but of course you don't have to go all the way to Japan just to get this lens. They're quite easy to find on eBay for around $800 to $850, and the used market seems to be flooded with them. That's a steal, considering the high-end image quality that you get is very comparable to lenses that are twice its price. This is just a first impression of this lens, and of course I do need more testing with it to really know and give more accurate information on it. One niche that I do want to try out more with this lens is landscape photography, and that is something I'm definitely going to be testing out more. I think it'd be interesting to use this lens as a one lens type of kit, where you can capture a whole host of different images while being more minimalistic. But what do you think about the 24-120? Is this a lens that you can see yourself picking up in the future? Let me know down in the comment section down below. But if there's also anything that you'd like to know about this lens, please let me know, because I can go ahead and test it out and give you guys some answers in a first review, or simply reply to you back in the comments. Anyways guys, thank you so much for experiencing the world with me today, and please feel free to check out another video right here if you like this one.